Welcome to Fantasy Audiobook. 1,000 years later, even my weakest follower has become a demon king. Chapter 46, Invitation. The Eighth Order was also known as the Hermit Order or the Cain Order. As the Eighth Holy Spirit was the only Holy Spirit that had been promoted from a mortal, the Eighth Order paid more attention to the union of secularism and faith than the other parishes of the Holy Spirit's Church. It emphasized the unity of the mortal and holiness. As for the Eighth Order, it was divided into two factions, Divine Grace and Holy Seminary. The former emphasized the sanctity of the Eighth Holy Spirit and advocated for the Eighth Order to completely integrate into the Holy Spirit's Church's system. At the very least, they didn't have to carry the title of Hidden Holy Spirit. As for the latter, the Holy Seminary paid more attention to the mortality of the Eighth Holy Spirit. The practitioners of the Holy Seminary would search the continent for the holy relics Cain had left behind when he still walked the mortal world. They would imitate his past deeds and work on providing relief, hoping to close the distance between their souls and the Holy Spirit. In that case, are you a Holy Seminary nun? On the way to Thorn City's graveyard, Nizamar suddenly introduced Cass to the composition of the Eighth Order for no reason. Cass asked curiously after hearing that. The reason why he felt this way was very simple. Judgment 4, apart from being a powerful weapon against the Moon Realm and capable of stopping the Duke's crazy plan, was closely related to Holy Spirit Cain when he was alive, so the Eighth Order was willing to pay such a huge price to obtain such a holy relic. Pursuing holy relics was undoubtedly the Holy Seminary's style. Nizamar nodded and said, "That's right. I'm a Holy Seminary nun. I'm mainly in charge of the recovery of holy relics." Cass continued asking, "Then, why are you suddenly telling me this? Don't tell me it's to introduce me to the Eighth Order." Nizamar frankly replied to Cass's question, "As a descendant of the Black Swordsman, you're the only person who can pull out Judgment 4. Your soul is also the most compatible with that weapon. Therefore, after this matter is resolved, I hope you can consider converting to the Eighth Order and joining the Holy Seminary." Before Cass could say anything, Liz, who had been sitting on his shoulder and listening to their conversation, couldn't hold it in any more. "What? No, no, no." Liz flew between Cass and Nizamar and crossed her arms at the blonde woman. "He's a servant I saved with great difficulty. Previously, he promised to take care of my garden until he died. How can I let him serve a Holy Spirit in some church? That's not going to happen." Nizamar glanced at Liz, who was flying in midair, before turning her gaze to Cass and continuing. "If you choose to convert to Cain, the parish will first guarantee that you'll be cleared of any injustice. Then, we'll help you awaken your magic talent. Although you probably don't have the talent to become a magic chanter, it's not a problem for you to become a magic swordsman. Apart from having an affinity for magic, becoming a magic chanter also required a certain level of mental talent, allowing the caster to construct precise spell models in their ether domain. However, to people who lacked mental talent, it didn't mean that they had no fate with magic. They could settle for the next best thing by relying on items engraved with spell models to release specific spells with their limited mana. The class that used mana like this was a spellblade. This was similar to Cass activating the fire spell enchanted on his sword, Breaking Dawn, but it was fundamentally different. As Cass wasn't a spellblade, he could only use the magic power stored in his sword for combat. Furthermore, he couldn't accurately control the consumption of mana when using it. All he could do was expend his mana. If he were a true spellblade, that battle would probably have ended long ago. Compared to magic chanters, the threshold for spellblades seemed to be much lower, but, in terms of numbers, the number of spellblades on the continent was the same as that of magic chanters. It might even be slightly fewer. Not only that, but most of the spellblades served in the army or were descendants of nobles. Commoners only accounted for an extremely small portion of spellblades. The reason was very simple. Most magic chanters were scholars, and only a small number would become battle mages who specialized in combat. Spellblades were without exception born for killing. Therefore, the Empire's officials allowed a certain number of magic chanters to be maintained among the commoners, but they prohibited a large number of spellblades to appear amongst them. Cass knew very well that no matter how much he improved in martial arts, it would only be a slight improvement. If he wanted to continue becoming stronger, spellblade was his only chance. However, ordinary people had virtually no way of becoming a spellblade. The condition he was offered was an irresistible temptation to any warrior, but... "Sorry, I've never been very pious towards the Holy Spirit's church. Moreover, I'm not very interested in a life of serving the church. Cass lowered his head slightly, his tone apologetic. Liz, who was originally furious, turned around in surprise. She quickly flew to Cass's side and calmed down. Then, she patted Cass's shoulder and said in the tone of an elderly, I knew you wouldn't be so heartless. Don't worry, I'll tone it down when you're tidying up the garden in the future. It seems like you've always been the one harping about me being your slave to help tidy up the garden. I've never agreed. 1. Cass thought, but he held back from saying it out loud. Nizamar looked as if she had expected his answer. I know what you're worried about. Your life is completely maintained by this fairy's life-scale powder. In a sense, you're dead, and you're only relying on her life force to drive it. You're worried that if you join the Eighth Order, you'll be risking her life force. Cass remained silent in response. She was right. If it weren't for the sake of taking revenge on those people, he wouldn't have been so thick-skinned as to risk his life with the innocent fairy's life force. And after his revenge, there was even less reason for him to do so. Nizamar continued, Don't worry. You may not wish to use her life force, but we too don't wish for the descendant of a judge, the holder of judgment to have their lives bound to a fairy. As long as you're willing to convert, the Eighth Order will contact 7 bishops to use resuscitation to make up for your missing life force. When that happens, this fairy can completely retrieve her scale powder. After providing this proposal, even Liz couldn't find a reason to object. She could retrieve her life scale powder, Cass could embark on the path of a spellblade, and the Eighth Order would have found a descendant who could use judgment. Everyone got what they wanted. The two of them and the fairy silently walked along the stone path for a long distance. Only when they were about to reach their destination did Cass say, if that's the case. However, Nizamar interrupted him. There's no need for you to make a decision now. Think about it carefully. As she spoke, the corners of her mouth curled up into an expression that could probably be called a smile. After all, it's hard to say if we can return alive. Under the cold moonlight, the city wall of the graveyard not far away cast a strange shadow. 1,000 years later, even my weakest follower has become a demon king. Chapter 47 Graveyard. The graveyard was north of Thorn City. If it was based on scale, it was more like a satellite city than a cemetery. Towering walls surrounded the entire cemetery. Spaced 20 meters apart on the walls were placating the undead and life barrier spell runes engraved by the Holy Spirit's Church and the Rose Palace's Mage Hall. Fortunately, Thorn City produced abundant elementium silver. If it were any other major city on the continent, even the Empire's capital, Platinum City, and the famously wealthy Tool City wouldn't be able to afford such extravagance. As the Blackwater Swamp believed in ancestor worship, people firmly believed that the souls of the dead needed their bones to exist. Therefore, most of the dead in Thorn City had been sent to this graveyard for burial for millennia. The corpses had accumulated over the years, and the number of dead buried inside had probably reached an incalculable number. The large number of corpses posed an extreme danger to this world where necromancy existed. Therefore, the graveyard was usually closed and heavily guarded, prohibiting outsiders from entering. Only on the Soul Return Festival on the 4th of the Rain Moon and the 15th of the Fog Moon would the gravekeepers here open the gates and allow residents to enter the cemetery to pay respects to their ancestors. The Holy Sepulchre you mentioned is built under the graveyard. Cass looked at the towering city wall and asked. It should be said that the cemetery is built above the Holy Sepulchre. The Holy Sepulchre's history is much older than the graveyard. It existed long before the Bronze Age. As Nizamar replied, she untied a bundle of ropes from her waist. Back then, the Blackwater people believed that the catacomb was the entrance to the netherworld, the place where Vera, or death, was reborn. Therefore, the ruler of that time chose this place as a graveyard, hoping that he could be reborn after death. It was also at that time that the idea of the living serving the dead appeared. Later on, it gradually evolved into the ancestral worship custom unique to the Blackwater province. As Nizamar spoke, she threw the grappling rope up. After tugging at the rope a few times to test its sturdiness, she turned around and said to Cass. All right, I'll climb up and take a look. I'll signal you to follow me when there's no problem. With that said, she nimbly climbed up the rope like a cat. Although the other party was wearing light leather armor, she was a lady after all. Cass found it embarrassing to stand below and stare at her. Therefore, He turned to look at Liz, who had been sitting on his shoulder sulking. What's wrong? Cass asked. Nothing. Seeing Cass turn his head, Liz immediately turned her head away and snorted with her nose raised. Cass guessed that she was still angry about what had happened, so he deliberated and said, "Isn't her suggestion quite good? If you can retrieve your life scale powder early, there's no need for you to be on tenterhooks every day about what happens to me. Of course, as for compensation. Do you think I want compensation or something from you?" Liz suddenly turned around and grabbed Cass's ear. Cass felt as if his ears had been twisted twice by her. "Do you want to be a spellblade that badly? Do you want to continue fighting elsewhere so badly? Didn't you say that you would retire after getting your vengeance? Can't you think of yourself more?" Liz pinched Cass's ear and said with a flushed face, "But I don't know what else I can do other than fight." Cass fell silent for a moment before answering. His words deflated Liz. She let go of Cass's ear, propped up her hands, and looked up at Cass's face in disappointment. "Then, have you never considered helping me tend my garden?" Cass was just about to answer when Nizamar's voice sounded from the city wall. "It's safe. You can come up now." While climbing the rope, Cass felt another burst of pain from the wound in his abdomen. When he reached the city wall, he lifted his clothes and checked. A faint blood mark seeped out of the bandage. "There's nothing we can do about it. It's normal for the wound to open up while climbing before it's healed," Cass said helplessly when he saw Nizamar and Liz look over. "There's no time to wait for you to completely recover. My informant in the Rose Palace told me that the Duke's big move is in the next few days. We have to get Judgment 4 as soon as possible to have a chance of winning," Nizamar replied. Liz sighed silently when she saw this. Sparkling scale powder began to appear around her wings again. "Hey, fairy over there, don't do that again." But before she could scatter the scale powder at Cass, Nizamar stopped her. "Although a fairy's vitality is much stronger than a human's, you shouldn't waste it like this." As Nizamar spoke, her hand lit up with a faint green light. "You've saved him from the brink of death twice. That isn't trivial even for a fairy." With that said, she pressed her hand on the wound at Cass's abdomen. Hand of Healing, expert level life magic. Although it only temporarily stopped the bleeding from Cass's ruptured wound, it still made him feel much better. After doing all of this, Nizamar turned to look at Liz and said, "You don't have much life force left. Don't waste it in such a place." Who's wasting it on him? I'm just afraid that his wound will be too deep and he will suddenly die. When that happens, I won't be able to recover all my scale powder." Liz raised her voice. "Shish." Cass gestured for her to keep quiet. A team called the Gravekeepers was perpetually stationed near the graveyard to prevent large-scale reanimations. It wouldn't be good if they discovered them and treated them as necromancers who had snuck in to steal corpses. Liz covered her mouth in acknowledgement. Looking at the temple in the middle of the graveyard, Cass whispered, "Are you sure that weapon is under that temple?" Nizamar nodded and replied, "I'm very sure. We learned of Judgment 4's whereabouts 10 years ago. Furthermore, we proposed to Duke Simon back then, but he found all kinds of reasons to reject us." As Nizamar spoke, she straightened the triangular hat on her head. The white feathers on the hat swayed slightly under the night wind. If it weren't for the fact that his relationship with the Empire's royal family deteriorated rapidly and that a few batches of intelligence personnel sent by the royal family were assassinated by magic chanters suspected of using Moon Realm power, we might have continued the back and forth with him. As she spoke, she walked down the wall stairs with Cass and Liz following behind her. Endless tombstones stood erected in the graveyard, one after another. The dead here were laid so densely that the living didn't even have a place to rest their feet. They could only step on tombstones for advancement. Cass accidentally cracked another tombstone loudly and couldn't help but complain. "Speaking of which, can't we take the main road? Must we step on the heads of the dead here?" He was a local of the Blackwater province, so he found it disturbing to disrupt the dead's peace. "There will be a guard patrol on the road at night. It will be troublesome if we're discovered." Nizamar, who was walking in front, replied without turning her head. Compared to Cass's tall and burly figure and the heavy weapon on his back, Nizamar leapt up and down nimbly like a cat on many graves. She was so agile that it was as if she was strolling at home. "Really, I don't see any light on the main road over there. They won't patrol without lights, right?" Cass looked in the direction of the road and asked. Upon hearing that, Nizamar stopped on a cross-shaped tombstone and turned to look over. Moreover, not only is there no light on the main road, but there's also no light from the camp at the entrance. Do they switch off the lights at this hour? Cass pointed at the entrance of the graveyard. At this moment, they were very close to the temple in the middle of the graveyard. It's a little strange, but there's no time to care. Let's. It was also at this moment that a black blast quickly spread from the temple to every corner of the graveyard. However, other than a gust of wind that wasn't too strong or weak, the fluctuation didn't affect the three of them at all. What was that? I sensed a magical power within, but why didn't it affect us at all? Liz asked in shock. As for Nizamar, she looked at the temple in the middle of the graveyard with a serious expression and said, "That's." Unfortunately, before she could finish speaking, the ground began to tremble violently. An earthquake. This was the first thought that came to Cass's mind, but cruel reality told him that the ground's tremors weren't as simple as an earthquake. It was much more terrifying than an earthquake. The tombstone under Nizamar's feet suddenly shattered, and a half-rotted arm grabbed her leg. At the same time, hundreds of millions of incomplete or complete, rotting, or bone-white hands tore through their coffins and soil in the graveyard, reaching out from the ground. It stretched as far as the eye could see. 1,000 years later, even my weakest follower has become a demon king. Chapter 48. An exhaustive plan. Astral Lighthouse, Astral Observatory. In front of Vincent was the stranger constellation that was connected to the astral circuit. Surging magic power was guided into the vast magic network from here and then resonated through the constellations into the ether domain of every registered magic chanter. As long as he obtained the authority to use this constellation, he could bypass the astral laws and establish a connection with the astral world, advancing to the legendary domain, a domain that had kept him out for more than 10 years. This was a promise Duke Simon had given him. However, Vincent sighed slightly. He didn't believe that Duke Simon's plan would succeed. Or rather, even if Duke Simon's plan succeeded, it definitely wouldn't be the bright future they had imagined more than 20 years ago. After being enlightened by the magic chanter named Presiding Judge, Vincent increasingly realized that his previous worries weren't unnecessary. How different would the fate of the Blackwater province ultimately be, whether it was controlled by the Empire or the Void Sovereigns? Moreover, Vincent recalled the Divine Realm magic chanter and his expression of having everything under control, as well as his confidence in letting him go after stating his request. Was Duke Simon's plan as foolproof as he said? Or was every step within that person's expectations? With this in mind, Vincent discovered the problem that had eluded him. Why did that person choose to appear in the Silverstream mine? Why did he let me off so easily? The Rose Palace's Mage Hall and the Bramble Guard's headquarters were two places where problems were more likely to arise because there were too many people. However, the first time he appeared was in the Silverstream mine. It had to be known that the Silverstream mine had always been handed over to the Moon Realm spirits to handle. Even the miners had been controlled via specially implanted soul-ingesting spider demons. Other than the supervisor sent over, even the people from the Mage Hall didn't know what was below. And he chose to appear in such a place. What was even more inexplicable was that not only did the magic chanter not leave after killing the presiding Moon Realm spirit, but he also calmly stayed where he was and specially created a chance to talk to him alone. If he hadn't long understood the Duke's plan, how could a Divine Realm magic chanter like him lower himself to change into a miner's outfit and infiltrate the Silverstream mine alone? It couldn't be that he came because he lacked elementium silver, right? Therefore, what was the other party's true goal in letting him go? A thought flashed through his mind like lightning. Could it be that he already expected me to tell the Duke what happened in the Silverstream mine? Upon having this realization, Vincent broke out in cold sweat. If that was the case, everything made sense. This was a trap the other party had planned from the beginning. Duke Simon planned on simultaneously holding the King and Rebel ritual and the Eternal Gift at the Holy Sepulchre. He did a perfect job of keeping it a secret. Even Vincent, the chief palace mage, didn't know. Needless to say, the Moon Realm spirit had been secretly in charge of the preparations. After the magic chanter destroyed the ceremonial temple under the Silverstream mine, he expected that the Duke might have a backup plan, but he didn't know where it was. Therefore, he deliberately triggered the Duke's sense of danger, making him choose to take the risk and begin the ritual. With this in mind, Vincent immediately stood up and walked to the Astral Observatory's door. The Duke's intentions had been exposed. He had to inform him quickly. Vincent pulled open the door to the astral observatory. Then, he was stunned. The divine realm mage who called himself the presiding judge stood at the entrance of the astral observatory with a serious expression. His being here was within the other party's expectations. Vincent thought in despair as he looked at the person in front of him. You already know. There were thousands of words in his mind, but they only turned into these words of admiration. It was too late. It was all too late. Vincent turned around dejectedly and walked back to the astral observatory. His entire body went limp as he sat in front of the stranger constellation. As for William, he looked at Vincent, who had suddenly become dispirited for some reason, and swallowed the words, "Why are you here?" After a moment of silence, he slowly walked into the astral observatory and closed the door with his elbow. Then, while paying attention to the surroundings for any ambushes, he walked to a spot not far in front of Vincent. What a coincidence. Although William didn't know what the other party meant, he pretended to be relaxed and sighed as an opening remark. However, the other party only replied dejectedly, "Coincidence. We walked right into your scheme. How is it a coincidence?" "My scheme." William was puzzled hearing what Vincent said. "What did I do?" However, although he didn't understand what the other party meant, he continued acting profoundly and spouted nonsense. "It might not all be part of my scheme, but sometimes, that is how fate is. Place everyone in the right time and place, and everything will happen naturally." 1. However, Vincent only chuckled bitterly at his words. Comparing your scheme to fate. Hey, there's probably no one in this world more arrogant than you. The muscles on William's face twitched unconsciously. Fortunately, Vincent was immersed in his decadence and didn't notice. It was really difficult to hold it in. Just as William was thinking about how to get information out of the other party spoke first. "Then, do it." He stood up and spread his arms, spreading his fingers. He indicated that he didn't have a magical medium in his hand and had exposed his body to the greatest extent. This was the posture of a magic chanter, showing that he was willing to die. William looked at his fearless expression and hesitated for a moment before asking, "Why should I kill you?" Vincent smiled in melancholy and said, "Didn't you say that as long as I choose to stand opposite you, you will not be merciful?" William nodded and hesitated for a moment. Then, he gritted his teeth and asked, "So you still chose to stand opposite me? Even though you already know that everything you do is under my control?" As he spoke, William secretly added the status of cold bloodline to himself so that his burning face wouldn't be so obvious. As for Vincent, he felt a suffocating cold aura of death emanating from the other party. It looked like the divine realm mage was planning on attacking. Therefore, he looked up at the sky, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Yes, even if you already know that the ceremonial venue is in the Holy Sepulchre, even if I know that we have no chance of winning, I still choose to stand opposite you." Bingo. He finally understood what was going on. Although he didn't know what the other party had misunderstood, it was good that he had said it himself. William excitedly reached into his pocket and snapped his fingers. However, he immediately realized what the other party meant. Holy Sepulchre. Isn't that the place that triggered the rotten moon tide? So that Duke planned on doing this. Creating an undead calamity. William suddenly felt a headache. If millions of undead were let out of their cages, it would be tiring killing them. He didn't know if his strategic spells could clear the area on a large scale. It wouldn't be anything like in-game where he performed extremely poorly because of his computer hardware's lacking performance, right? Thoughts raced through his mind. Then, he looked at Vincent, who was standing there silently waiting for death, and picked up the magical medium, planning to give the other party a quick death. But before that, William asked curiously, "I'm a little curious. Why are you willing to die instead of considering my suggestion? The conditions I offer aren't bad, right?" Vincent calmly replied, "Because I've long sworn that I'll only be loyal to Simon Wald." William felt that he had been flirting with the blind when he tried to recruit him. "But I see that you're also a person with ideas. Have you thought about whether Simon is a monarch worthy of your loyalty?" William continued asking. Vincent fell silent. Silence at this moment could be considered a response. Then, "Why are you still?" Vincent interrupted William before he could finish speaking. "He will keep his word, so I will naturally keep mine." "What did he promise?" William asked curiously. "He promised to protect my daughter, Liliana," Vincent replied. Upon hearing this, William extinguished the instant death spell on the magical medium. Your daughter might already be dead. 1,000 years later, even my weakest follower has become a demon king. Chapter 49 Loyalty. William's words made Vincent widen his eyes abruptly. He looked at the man in front of him with a ferocious expression. His hands reached into a spatial rift and pulled out an ebony magical medium. Instantly, the medium lit up with dazzling lightning. What did you do to my daughter? At this moment, Vincent, who was in the Astral Lighthouse's Astral Observatory and had received preliminary authorization from the Tower Guardian, could mobilize magic power at the legendary level. His mind had long exceeded the master level and was even stronger than many magic chanters who had just reached legendary. With the augmentation of the Astral Lighthouse, Vincent could be considered a middle-level existence even among legendary magic chanters. As Vincent brandished his magical medium, purplish-black dragon-shaped lightning gradually circled in the air and took shape. Crackling air explosions constantly exploded beside the lightning dragon, and the various decorations in the Astral Observatory were also sent floating in the air by the violent spatial fluctuations caused by the lightning. William frowned and looked at the powerful lightning in front of him. He tapped the magical medium in his hand and said, "Calm down." As he had cast Cold Bloodline buff on himself, William used a Frost-type control spell while the buff was still active. Mute Impact. A dense, cone-shaped frost aura blew out of the magical medium and deluged the nearby Vincent. Vincent's waving of the magical medium instantly froze. When the frost aura dissipated, every joint on his body was covered in thick frost, and his feet were firmly rooted to the ground by the frost. He was like a puppet whose joints had been welded shut. William walked to his side, raised the magical medium in his hand, and knocked on the head of the lightning dragon that was about to take shape. A dazzling light exploded, and the lightning dragon turned into countless specks of light and dissipated. "Have you calmed down?" William looked at Vincent, who was about to turn into an ice sculpture, and asked. However, from the other party's constant struggle and the murderous expression on his face, it didn't seem to be the case. "Why don't you listen to what others have to say?" William grumbled and continued, "I'm only saying that she might be dead, but I can't be sure of the current situation. But I might be the only person who knows her whereabouts. Are you sure you still want to attack me?" Vincent stopped struggling. He looked at William with bloodshot eyes and shouted, "Tell me, what's wrong with her now?" He seemed to lose his comprehension of human language when it came to matters related to his daughter. William sighed silently. Poor parents. There was no need for him to pick a quarrel with a father. Therefore, he said, "I already said that I don't know, however, I still know where she might be now. Furthermore, I can bring you there. However, the prerequisite is that you have to calm down. Otherwise, the probability of Liliana surviving will decrease if you delay for another second. Think about it." William waited for 5 seconds and saw the other party's expression gradually soften in intensity. Finally, rationality appeared in his eyes again. He raised his staff and said, "I'll remove your shackles next, but if you attack me again, I won't show mercy." As he spoke, he removed Mute Impact. The condensed frost instantly turned into magic power and disappeared. Vincent knelt on the ground due to his frosted joints. However, he immediately struggled to stand up on all fours. "Where is she now? Bring me to her quickly." Vincent staggered to his feet and immediately said to William, "Shut up." William recalled the location where the Phoenix Pendant's mark disappeared in his ether domain and said impatiently. About 10 seconds later, he said to Vincent, "I roughly know where she is. Wait a moment." As he spoke, he took out 6 azure gems from his pocket and threw them into the air. Blinking lightning connected them to form a portal. Flowing light fluctuated over the portal, gradually revealing a simple guest room. Liliana was lying motionless on a wooden bed. Before William could say anything, Vincent passed through the portal and rushed over. How is he not worried that there's danger? William thought. Because portals were extremely vulnerable to interference, most mages would often be extremely cautious when using a portal, especially one opened by others. There were countless instances of being killed by an explosion while passing through a portal. William didn't say anything and followed behind him. On the other end of the portal, Vincent half knelt in front of the wooden bed and carried Liliana while trembling. At this moment, Liliana's eyes were tightly closed, and her expression was constantly twisting. Upon hearing William walk over, Vincent turned his head and asked him, "What happened to her?" "She's having a nightmare," William answered matter-of-factly. "She doesn't wake up no matter how I call out to her." That's a very nasty nightmare, William replied. It might be a high-level illusion, or it might be a curse. Of course, it's also possible. As William spoke, he walked to the bed and pressed his hand on the girl's forehead. What else is possible? Vincent asked anxiously. It's also possible that her soul was pulled to the moon realm by a goddess you plan to believe in. Withdrawing his hand, William said to Vincent with a cold expression, I'm sorry to tell you that it's the worst possibility. Lord of Nightmare, Samara. Liliana's soul was pulled to the nightmare swamp? Vincent asked with a pale face. William nodded. How did this happen? Vincent muttered to himself in a daze. However, William said coldly, first, her archaeological team was attacked by the Lady of Starvation's stumbling demon, and now, her soul has been pulled into the moon realm of the Lord of Nightmare. Do you have to wait until she's schemed against by the Whispering Empress again before you can guess why? Vincent looked at William and said with a blank expression, but that's impossible. I've never betrayed him. He also knows. His voice became softer and softer as he spoke. Then, he hugged Liliana tightly and gradually fell silent. William stood at the side and waited patiently. After a while, Vincent turned his head expressionlessly and said to him, Can my daughter be saved? William nodded. Save her, Vincent said. William didn't agree immediately. Instead, he waited for him to continue. Vincent hugged Liliana and continued, I swear to all the gods in the world that as long as you save my daughter, I shall pledge my loyalty to you. From now on, every wisp of my soul, every drop of blood, every bone, every piece of flesh, and every thought will fight for you until death. With that said, he gently put Liliana down and walked in front of William, preparing to kneel with a solemn expression. However, an invisible force held him up and stopped him. Vincent looked at the weather-beaten man in front of him in confusion. At this moment, he was pointing at the magical medium at his knees. What oath to all the gods in the world, didn't I tell you? My goal is to eternally liberate the fate of humanity from the gods. As he spoke, William smiled faintly. Moreover, remember one thing, you're not allowed to kneel. 1,000 years later, even my weakest follower has become a demon king. Chapter 50 Undead Tide. The tombstone under Nizamar's feet suddenly shattered, and a rotted arm grabbed her calf. Just as she was about to lose her balance and fall to the ground, the woman's eyes suddenly lit up with a faint silver light. A silver nexus appeared below her before a powerful cyclone lifted her into the air. Floating in midair, Nizamar kicked off the hand that was trying to firm its grip on her calf before landing lightly. The moment she landed, she pulled out the rapier at her waist and stabbed at the newly awakened dead under the tombstone at lightning speed. A stream of light traveled across the rapier, and silver flames that resembled mist instantly ignited. The dead struggled and turned to dust. She eliminated one of the dead. However, millions of the dead were awakening. The ground continued trembling. The sound of soil cracking continuously rumbled. People who should have been dead long ago woke up as their incomplete soul fires were ignited by some force and eventually gathered into an unstoppable tide of the dead. Cass had already removed the black iron sword from his back and destroyed the dead that approached them. However, more of the dead replaced the fallen ones. Even the corpses that had been knocked down would slowly and firmly approach them with their broken bodies until they were reduced to immobile blocks. This is terrible, Cass thought. In the distance, under the cold moonlight, more awakened undead swarmed over them like a wave. At this moment, it was as if they had fallen into a swamp and were slowly dragged into the abyss of death. With another heavy swing, the black iron sword beheaded 3 skeletons and a zombie, but this strike was blocked by a bronze halberd. An undead warrior wearing bronze armor from the ancient Blackwater Kingdom appeared among the zombies. It looked as tall as Cass, and its eyes burned with intense soul fire. The halberd in its hand was covered in rust as it crossed Cass's huge sword. Its movements weren't as stiff and rigid as the surrounding undead. Instead, it was as agile as when it was alive. After blocking Cass's strike, it immediately raised the halberd in its hand and stabbed at Cass's throat with the advantage of the weapon's long range. Although the other party's movements were as quick as a venomous snake, Cass's years of combat intuition allowed him to narrowly dodge the thrust. The halberd only left a shallow wound on his neck. Taking advantage of the other party's missed strike, he dragged his huge sword and charged at the undead warrior, slashing at the other party's left rib. However, with a clang, fine green snake-shaped runes suddenly lit up over the bronze armor. Cass felt as if his strike had struck a thick wall, and the intense recoil forced him to take 2 steps back. Enchanted armor. This person was a military noble when he was alive. Cass adjusted his breathing and carefully observed the weak connections between the other party's armor. After making a mental calculation, he immediately raised the sword in his hand and charged forward again. After 5 to 6 clashes, Cass found the other party's weakness and closed in. His sword passed through the gap between the other party's helmet and neck guard and cleanly severed the other party's neck. But before Cass could catch his breath, he looked up and saw about 20 undead warriors in bronze armor neatly lined up not far away. From the looks of it, there's a tomb of an ancient Blackwater Kingdom's military noble nearby. The corners of Cass's mouth twitched as he thought. It will be over if they get close. Nizamar, do you have a way out of here? Cass stared at the horde of undead warriors and roared. The roars of the undead tearing out of the earth continued. He could only shout with all his might to drown out the sound. Nizamar shouted a few seconds later, I have a way to escape the undead and give us some distance from them, but we're too far from the walls. That distance isn't enough for us to escape. Upon hearing this, Cass immediately said to the afloat Liz, is there anywhere nearby to go? Liz immediately flapped her wings and flew higher to look around. Then, she flew back to Cass's side with a whoosh and hurriedly pointed at the Holy Sepulchre temple in the middle of the graveyard. There's a circle of black light there. The undead will turn around and leave when they approach that light. Cass hesitated when he heard this answer. The thing that awakened the entire graveyard's undead was definitely something in the Holy Sepulchre. Even a fool could tell. If he entered, it would probably be even more dangerous than here. However, looking at the horde of undead warriors gradually approaching them, Cass shouted at Nizamar, who was fighting behind him, the temple in the middle of the graveyard. The undead can't enter, so we can take a breather over there. Staying here would ultimately result in death. It was better to enter the temple and see who the culprit was. At the very least, he could die in peace. 2 seconds later, Nizamar's, okay, sounded from behind. Then, a silver nexus appeared under Cass's feet. Before he could react, a powerful whirlwind lifted him into the air. LV. 3 storm spell, float. Stand up and jump over one by one. Nizamar, who had also floated in midair, said to Cass, what do you mean by jumping one by one? Cass knew the answer before he finished asking. From their current location to the temple in the middle, more than 10 silver nexus instantly lit up. Then, more than 10 floating cyclones rose. Many of the cyclones had thrown out the undead as they flailed their limbs in midair. Was this the method she mentioned, to put some distance between them? Cass looked at the dozen or so nexus and didn't know what to say. As for Nizamar, she said to him, be careful. One wrong jump and you're dead. As she spoke, she suddenly smiled at herself. Then, she held the rapier and jumped toward the nearest floating cyclone. This woman only seems to smile sincerely when discussing dangerous topics. Cass thought as he watched the other party's nimble back. A slight pain came from his left hand. He looked down. Liz was staring at him while pinching his finger. What are you thinking? Hurry up and jump over. This spell won't last long. Liz reminded him, her tone filled with displeasure. Cass hurriedly nodded before leaping. Compared to Nizamar, he clumsily jumped onto the next floating cyclone. It's easier than I thought, Cass thought to himself after stabilizing himself before immediately jumping to the next cyclone. The two of them jumped past the dozen or so cyclones one after another. Finally, before the spell disappeared, they jumped into the black circle of light in the middle temple and arrived at an area that the undead tide temporarily couldn't reach. However, the duo didn't let down their guard at all. The moment they landed, they gripped their weapons tightly and looked around warily. Why did those undead? Cass, who had observed for a while and realized that there were no ambushes around, asked. Why did they revive? Nizamar interrupted his question. You're a Blackwater native. You should know the history of the Rotten Moon Tide better than me.